Vision Christian Radio. It's Neil Johnson with you. It is the Tuesday edition of 2020 and a conversation coming over this next hour. If nothing else, you will be engaged. You might be entertained. I hope that you are challenged by some of the things that we'll talk about today and alignments of things in the past with things that may be happening in the present. Times are changing, aren't they? Faster than we can all process easily. Some are asking, has the government, whether it's federal or state, completely lost any moral compass? Or are they just pushing boundaries? The political battles are not always goodies versus baddies. As a Christian, you know that both sides of a debate can be influenced by a deepening move towards what we might even call a secular, values-free zone that's driven by ideology and propaganda. We wonder how our biblical Christian values can be so easily sidelined and what we should do. Well, a conversation today with a special guest who is preparing right now to deliver a biblical survey of how the people of God engage with pagan governments. David Ould is Senior Associate Minister at St John's Anglican Cathedral in Parramatta in Sydney. He unapologetically defends biblical Christianity, and he'll be one of the speakers at this weekend's Church and State Summit that's on in Brisbane. David, a special welcome back to 2020.
Oh, thank you, Neil. It's great to be back with you. It's been far too long.
It has been far too long. I'm not sure whose fault that is, but I'll put my hand up and say it's me not being in touch with you.
Let's take it 50-50. Yeah.
Hey, David, as we get a conversation like this underway, now, I think there's some important things for us to just set in place maybe as a foundation, and some might be aligning right now, our federal and state governments in the mix of pagan governments. Is that fair and accurate?
So I've used the word pagan. It's quite a provocative word, right? But in the New Testament, it just simply means unbelieving. And one of the things we've just got to get our head around is that our governments are fundamentally unbelieving governments. Even if from time to time a Christian becomes prime minister or premier of a state, I think we've got to get our head around the whole structure is at a more core level unbelieving. And by unbelieving, I don't mean doesn't have some sort of legacy in Judeo-Christian morality or ethics. I mean, doesn't have the gospel of Jesus at its core. And that's actually an important principle of Australia. I mean, Section 116 of our Constitution is really, really clear on that. And that's a good thing. It actually protects, doesn't it, lots of different minorities and people. Yeah.
And just your thoughts here, because some might be thinking the government is now so far gone down a pagan path, let's just use that terminology, that maybe it's not redeemable. Others might be saying, well, wait a minute, this is all fluid. Just because they're going in a wrong direction on a whole lot of issues doesn't mean there can't be a chance to rescue the situation. What are your thoughts here? I mean, you can tar everyone with a brush and say they're all in the pagan category, or is there an opportunity here to re-engage, change the direction, and reform?
Well, I think the first thing we want to recognize is that governments really tend to reflect the way that society more generally is moving for whatever reasons that it moves, where it goes. We are in a much more rapidly culturally changing and philosophically changing environment than we were maybe even 50 or 100 years ago. So there are some rapid changes going on, and our governments reflect that. So in principle, you might want to argue that there is, because it moves, there's always a chance that it might move back. I think the reality is we can see the direction that our culture is moving at the moment in terms of how it understands where truth comes from and what are the great moral goods that we ought to be pursuing and defending. My gentle gut is it's going in a direction that is going to be unhelpful for people in general, and I would say beginning to be more and more hostile towards Christianity, where people aren't just apathetic about us now. They actually see the positions that we take as harmful.
Some might even say, as you use the word unhelpful for people, we're talking about all Australians, some will say, wait a minute, Dave, you're not going far enough here. What the policies are of our governments, be they federal or state, are oftentimes very hurtful to the nation, because we've got some history that says these things work. If you brush those to the side, hurt is on the way.
Yeah, look, I totally agree. So, for example, look at some of the laws being legislated in Victoria recently. I think there are some shocking decisions being made about what is good for people or not. But I think what we've got to get our head around is it's not uniform all the time. And one of the things I see Christians do in particular is overreact to one thing and not read the ground where they're at. I was at a forum last night with the leader of the opposition here in New South Wales. We've obviously got the state election coming up in New South Wales, and I've got to say, Labour Party, probably a lot of people in the room would instinctively be wanting to vote Liberal. I think I'm fair to say that, just on moral issues, which are very big at the moment, especially in the west of Sydney. But I've got to say, I heard a panel of Labour politicians, and was able to speak to them afterwards, who I think were much more sympathetic and understanding, and even resonating with some of the key issues that were being raised. So I think we shouldn't slip into this danger of just saying it's all the same everywhere. There are different things going on everywhere, and it requires a bit of nuance and engagement and understanding, all the while also being able to say to people, I don't think you appreciate where that's going. So last night, Chris Minns, leader of the Labour Party in New South Wales, was asked the classic question on safe spaces for women. It was the trans question. I think in Queensland, where you are, the government's putting in a thing where you can just say, oh, I'm a different sex to what I was, and then biological men can, on that basis, walk into women's spaces, and that's a big issue for many women. He had nothing, like he just didn't know what to say on that. He gave us a nothing answer, and I think there's still space for us to go to guys like that. You need to understand where this is going, whereas in other jurisdictions, it's already gone, hasn't it?
The interesting and important element that I can hear you sharing here, as you were there and you saw those, the Labor leader and a panel of the likely front bench or the shadow front bench, is that when you're in opposition, your ears are open and you are listening, at least, to the constituency. You find yourself on the government side benches, and your ears have closed because you think the people have voted to give you a mandate to do what you said you were going to do, even if it was bad. So when you've got an opposition and you've got a Christian set of leaders who are actually firing some questions, looking for some real answers, this is great, isn't it? Because you've got listening ears.
Yeah, it is, and it is a moment to grasp, and I don't think we can always assume that they are listening. 2 federal elections ago, Labour got smashed in the west of Sydney, and they were smashed because they were perceived as being hostile to sincere religious belief. Bill Shorten was their candidate at the time, and he'd said some stuff around the gay marriage debate, and they got shellacked in the west of Sydney. They recovered a little bit in the more recent federal election, more because Scott Morrison's government had become so unpopular. I don't think it was a massive swing towards Labour as much as away from the Liberals. But speaking to some of those front bench politicians last night, I can think of one person in particular I spoke to. They basically said, we've learned from that. And what you see represented today is a very different set of people. So I think we've just got to be aware that within the parties themselves, there is a variety of approaches, and in the different states as well. It's not one size fits all. It's going to require deliberate, meaningful engagement by us.
Let's come back to our conversation topic, and it's a little bit like I feel like we're talking about ancient times, but there's a veiled view of what might be happening currently. I want to ask you, because we're talking about how the Christian engages with pagan governments. And let's talk about the people of God here for a few moments, because, as Christians, biblical people, we say we're in this world, but we're not of this world. We're aliens. Absolutely. So we're passing through. Yeah. Some take that to say, well, I don't have to worry about the engagement with the politics and the values and those things that are happening. I'm just passing through here. What are your thoughts on the people of God and the prospect of engagement?
Yeah, so it's about understanding what the priorities are, and what the ultimate priorities are. So there's a couple of sort of, I almost want to go ranked priorities. First of all, there is a clear priority in the scriptures for the creation itself, and especially humanity made in the image of God as the pinnacle of creation. So the man and the woman are made in Genesis 1 at the end, and it's clearly the last and the seventh binary of the binaries that are there in Genesis 1. And so whether you read that narrative as a strict narrative, or you read it more as picture language, the message is still there. And so people become very important, and what happens to them becomes very important. And you see that worked out in the life of the nation of Israel, in lots of laws about looking after those who need looking after, and then the prophets rail against Israel for not doing that. But almost over and above, and the bringing together of it all is then that higher thing which consummates that, which says, and the ultimate goal of the people of God is to be at rest in the place where God is to be with them, of which the nation of Israel and the land serves only as a shadow or a type of that final, we might say, eschatological reality, to use the big words. But we're longing for a day, aren't we? Not where we sit on fluffy clouds plucking harps, but where we belong to a new creation, this world recreated with sin removed, the precursor of which, of course, is Jesus' own resurrection itself. So then the question is, as I long for that day and as I wait for that day, how do I engage and work it out here as the government above me doesn't hold to those things, and therefore starts to act in the creation in ways that are not least foolish, but sometimes evil. The first example I think you've got of it is the Hebrew midwives in Exodus, right? So the people of God find themselves in Egypt, and the king is scared of them, wants to kill them all off, and you get these brilliant Hebrew midwives who basically just they break the law. The king says they must kill the Hebrew babies before they're born, and the Hebrew midwives don't want this, and so they look after the babies and rescue them. And when they're challenged, they go, these Hebrew women, they're so strong and vigorous, they give birth and they get the babies are out and gone before we get there. What are we going to do? And it's a wonderful moment, right? Because I mean, I love the snark of it, but two, it does tell us there is a time to resist the pagan authority. So clearly at this moment where the king says kill the babies, the God's people go no, and they show tremendous courage in doing it. So you get like the setup there for, well, whatever this is going to look like, there are boundaries to us simply saying yes.
When you talk about rest, now that might be the sticking point for some who say we're just passing through here, we're on our way to rest. Know we're just surviving as we're going. But the battles that we might read of in the Old Testament, they were battles that had to be fought before there could be a time of rest. Sometimes you've got to fight for the freedom. Sometimes you've got to fight for the rest, haven't you?
Well, I think you've got to be very careful, because, again, you've got to work out what's going on with the Old Testament. And when it comes to this language of rest and the land, the New Testament's, it tells us how to understand it. So we don't have to guess. So the writer of the Hebrews in chapters 3 and 4 looks at all of that, and he says quite clearly that was not the final rest that was intended. It was only a shadow or a type. The great rest is that great Jerusalem that is yet to come, that mountain that cannot be shaken. It's actually a future event. So sometimes one of the mistakes that we make is we take the very physicality of the Old Testament, which was meant to point us towards those greater hopes, and we think that's the end game. We're actually understanding that the New Testament tells us it was always intended to point us forward. Abraham, the writer tells us, lived in a tent because he knew the city and the land that he was promised was not actually the physical land that he was on. So the Christian hope is of this new creation. But that doesn't just mean that we're just passing through and just, hanging on with our fingernails for dear life and just coping. Because again, we live in this wonderful creation that God made, and he intended us to live in it and to enjoy it and to care for it and to prosper in it as a precursor and as a foretaste for what is yet to come. So yes, Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. When ultimately he stands in front of the government of the day and he goes, it's something bigger. Like, if you think I'm about being king here, you've missed the point. And yet it's the same Jesus who walked through the land, healing and caring and restoring that same physical creation. So it's just about getting that nuance and that balance right.
Well, I want to open our talkback lines for listeners
Sure.
to participate. So 1-800-316-316. You might want to join in our conversation if we're talking through this issue, how the people of God engage with pagan governments. You might have your own insights, perhaps on the ancient or on the current challenges that are going on even in our present day. David Ould is our special guest, Senior Associate Minister, St John's Anglican Cathedral in Parramatta in Sydney. He is one of the speakers at this weekend's Church and State Summit in Brisbane. churchandstate.com.au to connect with getting a hold of a place at that summit. It's going to be pretty amazing. And davidould.net to connect with David. We're going to be talking some more in just a few moments. And our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. You might want to engage with our conversation. We're talking about what our special guest is preparing to deliver, a biblical survey, you might say a biblical study of how the people of God engage with pagan governments. He's going to be a speaker at the upcoming Church and State Summit this weekend. Unapologetically defending biblical Christianity, David Ould is our guest. We are taking calls on 1-800-316-316. We'll take some calls in just a few moments, but David, just quickly, when we're talking through the issue we are now, and you're going to be presenting a survey, a biblical survey, and you're going to be addressing the language of Babylon and how it's used in the Old Testament and the New Testament. What do we need to understand if we're talking paganism and Babylon? They are aligned.
Yeah, so Babylon becomes one of the paradigms, one of the images that is prevalent in the scriptures to describe a world in rebellion against God, and therefore, if you like, the enemy of Jerusalem. So the word Babylon comes originally from Babel, that famous thing in Genesis 11 where the people of God get together and just say, we want to be God, and God goes, I don't think so, and scatters them everywhere. But then obviously Babylon becomes the means by which God uses to punish the nation and take them into exile. And then as you get the people of God in Babylon in exile, they start to work out what it means for them to live not as they should be. They should be in God's place, under God's rule, living according to His promise. But they found themselves in this strange place from which they long to return to the promised land. What's really interesting is that the New Testament authors, particularly you see it in the Revelation, but then most of all, I think quite clearly in the Apostle Peter in his first letter, he writes to Christians as though they're living in Babylon. He calls them the exiles scattered in the world. He talks to them about how they then need to refer to the emperor, because of course Rome is ruling then, and he holds out for them the language of the return to the promised land as their great hope, which of course he is quite clear is when Jesus returns and all things are made new.
Okay, a very good clarification there. Taking calls, 1-800-316-316. Let's hear from Graham in Tasmania. Hello, Graham, welcome.
Hello, gentlemen. Look, this is actually prophecy in process, what's happening now. This is foretold in the Old Testament and the New Testament, because the nations, especially the so-called Christian nations, have been blessed by God. They've turned away from God. And this is what we're going to get. Revelation chapter 3, verse 10, I think it is, about those who have kept my testimony and endure. I shall protect them from the hour the trouble that will come upon the whole earth, about all mankind being tested. And we're there now, and it's very close. Our true Christianity, if we're true Christians, we're going to have to put our neck on the line or on the block, because this is what's happening. Also, the Pope is pushing for a one-world religion, and even the Muslims, the young Arab guy down in Arabia there, he's setting up church and even a mosque, not a mosque, I mean You know what I'm trying to
Yeah,
say.
look, Graham, let's not get into that issue. Might take us off on a tangent, but come back to putting your neck on the block, because it would seem to me that when Christians engage with the pagan governments, getting your thoughts here, David Ould, when reform comes, usually there are heads that do roll, literally. Any thoughts here about when you've got something that gives you that freedom, that liberty, you want to hold on to it, because actually fighting your way back usually means the blood of martyrs being shed. Thoughts here for Graham?
Yeah. So, Graham, thanks for your question. Yeah, Neil, that's the right thing to ask. There is clearly a trait of Christians gently and humbly claiming their rights in the face of a pagan government. So you see that with Daniel. You see that with the way that he interacts with the great kings. You see it with the Apostle Paul. What's really interesting with the Apostle Paul is that on a number of occasions he says to the people dealing with him badly, look, hang on, guys, I'm a Roman citizen. That means that you need to treat me fairly under the law. I actually have a right to speak about things, and I've got a right to due process. So there is that. I think there's certainly the biblical model of going, not demanding, obstreperously. That's my big word for the day. But actually going, no, these are rights, and at this point we want to exercise them. So I think go for that. I think I just want to go just back on the quote from Revelation, if you may, as a preacher, and that's a passage that we've preached through recently at church. I just want to go, let's just be really clear what it is and what it's not talking about. It's speaking to the church in a pagan environment. I'm always personally very wary of this notion of Christian nation for the reason that I set up for you right at the start. We may be a nation with that Western liberal legacy, with the Judeo-Christian values, but we've never been a nation founded on the gospel. We've been a nation heavily influenced by the ethics and the virtues that the gospel brings. Now, that's not a bad thing, but we should never, in these big debates, we ought to never confuse the gospel itself with the ethics that it produces. The danger is we slip into moralism and confuse that for the actual gospel of grace and forgiveness and restoration.
Hey, Graham, does that satisfy your query and the comment you were making?
Well, look, the fact is that we are at, and I know this world, anyone that knows their Bible, we're on the edge of a new world. This world's in great dire straits. And I'd say that no matter what you say, we're going to be road railed off the tracks. And so the point is, there's all this nonsense and foolishness coming in of our governments. This is what's to be expected these days.
Graham,
so
I don't want to, I'm not your critic. I appreciate your thoughts, but there's a little bit of a defeatism in the thought that somehow or other, it's all going to be inevitable, that we're going to be steamrolled. And some might argue, and there might be different positions in the scriptures, but quickly on this sort of thing, David, hope we have, a kingdom mindset, up against what might be a pagan-oriented government. Isn't the story of the establishment of the church just a testimony to the fact that, within 400 years, Christianity was the state religion in Rome. Rome, a pagan empire. Your thoughts here, just briefly?
Yeah, so there's a tendency sometimes for us to go, it's never been as bad as this. It's getting worse. The reality is that it's been far worse for the church in the last 2,000 years in many, many other places, and we're just now stepping into a taste of that, and we've been shielded from it from the past. I mean, Graham's very right to say we're on the edge of the new creation. And that's the way that the New Testament consistently speaks, as though there is this thin veil to be pulled aside and blam, it's there. But also, Jesus says there'll be wars and rumors of wars. this is not the end. Don't be fooled. Many of the greats throughout Christian history have thought that, theirs was the moment when Jesus was coming back. So Martin Luther, famously, with all the just the turmoil that was unleashed in Europe at that time, he was thoroughly convinced Jesus was coming within his lifetime, and others have been as well. And please don't hear me denying the return of Jesus. I long for it. I long for it. I long for it, especially as I get older, because I really want a new creation. But we just, there's nothing new under the sun. 'Twas ever thus, and it will come like a complete surprise when it does. And gosh, it will be wonderful. In the meantime, we understand it will be this way. How do we respond to it?
Graham in Tasmania, thank you so much for your call. We're about to break for news. Our conversation continues after Vision National News. You're welcome to join in our conversation. You might have your own thoughts. You might even have a critique for the conversation. That is fine too. You might want to align some current events, things that are happening right now, with the things that we are talking about. 1-800-316-316. We're discussing how the people of God engage with pagan governments. And our talkback line open with our special guest, David Ould, who's Senior Associate Minister at St John's Anglican Cathedral in Parramatta in Sydney. DavidOuld.net to connect directly to David. He's one of the speakers at the Church and State Summit this weekend, churchandstate.com.au, to make sure you've got your place booked there. We're back with more after news. Wonderful to have you with us. It is the Tuesday edition of 2020. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. We're having a conversation today based on some study that is about to be delivered to Christian leaders who'll be a part of the Church and State Summit, and our special guest is going to be delivering his segment at the Church and State Summit, talking about how the people of God engage with pagan governments. Well, as you know, there's lots of organisations that do that sort of engagement too. Organisations like the Australian Christian Lobby, or Family Voice Australia, or Christian Voice Australia, and all of those organisations that are advocating for good things from a Christian foundation. And times are changing so fast, faster than we can all process easily. Some of us are asking, has the government completely lost any moral compass? Or are they just pushing boundaries? Well, the political battles are not always goodies versus baddies. As a Christian, you know that both sides of the debate can be influenced by a deepening move towards a secular, values-free zone, driven by ideology and propaganda. We're talking through these things today, how the people of God engage with pagan governments. David Ould is our special guest. He's Senior Associate Minister at St John's Anglican Cathedral in Parramatta in Sydney, and unapologetically defending biblical Christianity. He's one of the speakers this weekend at the Church and State Summit that is on in Brisbane. David, in this part of our conversation, and I know we want to touch on some of the things that are happening, and even around the Australian Christian Lobby. Some listeners will be familiar that there's a little bit of a crisis that's going on at the present time. But before we talk about anything to do with that, let me ask you about engagement with pagan governments. There's a kingdom dimension that the believer needs to appreciate, that God is transcendent, that what is happening here and now is influenced by him as king and in his transcendence. There's a sense in which we began to talk about things that are happening today. And just to give a context here for your thoughts, because here in Australia, at least we have a voice right now. It might feel like it's a fading voice. Some might even say we have a fading democracy, but there's 360 million people around the world who are under high levels of persecution, and they don't have a voice. We've got a voice. This kingdom element here, though, I wonder if you've got any thoughts as to how that kingdom element translates into the way we engage with a pagan government.
Sure. So you're right. We do have a voice, and it's our responsibility to use it wisely and effectively. How does what we believe impact? Well, I'm an Anglican minister. Let me give you an example of how it impacts. I'm an Anglican minister, and of course, as part of that, I marry people. If you read the preface to the marriage service in the Book of Common Prayer, 1662, which is the bit you read at the very start to tell everybody what you're actually doing, one of the things that you mentioned, one of the goods of marriage is that children, it's a safe and secure environment for children to be brought up. And then the minister, as he's saying that, says this is for their good and the good order of society. So there's this that's a real articulation of this sense that when things are done the way that God created them to be, then that is to everyone's benefit. Another category the scriptures use for that is this category of wisdom. Wisdom is about understanding the creation so that I can know how to live best in it so that everything benefits. So in one sense, you might argue Christian lobbying of governments is not least, it's other things as well, but it's not least saying, hey, listen, this is what we think is the wisest way to live for the maximum benefit of everybody. It's not just self-interest. It's like we want everyone to do well. Sometimes that'll be on controversial topics. So, for example, we don't shy away from issues like adoption and marriage and so on. But we're thoroughly convinced that certain decisions need to be made for the best outcomes for everyone. And so, I think lobbying done well does that, but it's never unhitched, never unmoored from the gospel which lies behind it, which of course is a gospel of God's generosity and of giving. So the creation is a great act of generosity and goodness by God, and the most wonderful example of that is the gospel itself. And so what we need to do is keep working at explaining not just what we think is good, but why, what underpins it, what are the fundamental principles sitting behind it that we're trying to apply into this. And that's always the difficulty, because the principles are the gospel themselves. And then the outworkings are the ethics. And possibly that's what's been going on, I think, as you read some of the stuff going on around the ACL decision of this last week. You can clearly see them. They're juggling that tension. How much do we do the application wisdom stuff? And how much do we do the gospel stuff that lies behind? And clearly there's a disagreement, an expectation gap on what that looks like between the board and Martin, who they've let go. But also, we don't know the full story yet, do we? So
we don't know the full story, and listeners might have a comment or a question that will be welcome too. And we're sensitive the way we are going to be talking about these things. But we're actually talking, and we're in the deep end here. But we are talking about some things that undergird the way that the church has any influence in our society. When we talk about God, the King, and his transcendence, when we talk about the way that believers engage, we know, David, that the church itself is not a lobby organisation. It does exert pressure, and there is a certain, sometimes behind closed doors, pressure that's being exerted very powerfully by church leaders. And we know that the church is a ministry institution. It's ordained by God. But there is some parachurch organisations, and it's not just Christian schools and aged care and child care and everything else that churches do in caring in the welfare for a community, but it's also got this parachurch lobbying opportunity which identifies what the challenges and the problems are that need to be addressed. Yeah. And so the lobbying organisation itself is under the umbrella of the church, which is under the umbrella of God. There's context in all of this, isn't there?
There is, and we also need to be wise about how that work is done. So sometimes there's a space for public statements and proclamations, and if they think an issue is big enough, we'll go public on it. So often there's a lot of behind-the-scenes work. I mean, I gave you an example of last night. Just after the event, I sit and I talk to a couple of key opposition bench speakers. But on other things, it's you build the relationships. You get people to help them to understand where you're coming from. And you can have some wonderful examples. Can I give you one example of that? In the middle of COVID, here in Sydney, I'm in the Fairfield local government area. We had those rules for a while where you just couldn't leave the local government area because there was such concern over the spread of COVID. Now, setting aside whether that was justified or not, let's just deal with the fact it was there. That was a real issue for a number of ministers who ministered outside of their LGA. And we found ourselves in the position where we had, to various degrees, willingly submitted to the rules that were placed upon us. But we got to a point where there were a number of us were going, we're going to have to break the law. And we don't want to break the law, but the only way we can meet our obligation on this is to break the law. And especially those guys, one guy on their own ministering in a church. Now, at that point, what are you going to do? You can just shout and scream and stamp your feet. What I actually did is I picked up the phone to two MPs, my MP at where the cathedral is based and my MP here where I live, a local state MP, and they were opposite sides of the political spectrum. And I said to both of them, please help us. This is the position that we're in. We know what we're all about. You know what we're not all about. We're at the point where we will break the law. We don't want to. Please get us out of this situation. And 3 days later, the health minister announced a change to the rules for ministers of religion. And I don't say that to go, look at me, I was special. I go, there's many ways to skin the cat. And that's also part of biblical wisdom as well.
And I know that there'll be listeners who can appreciate a gentle and yet firm assessment of a situation that can be relayed in a telephone call that doesn't need a protest on the street.
Yes.
But when you get to a point where you say we have to have the protest on the street, and I've got to say we had these sorts of conversations too through the crisis times, and wonderful wisdom came through lobby organisations, Christian lobby organisations that said hold back on civil disobedience because there are other levers that are able to be used before civil disobedience is necessary. So we've got to have wisdom in these sorts of context. Now,
I think so, yeah.
Just come back to the Australian Christian lobby for a few moments,
Sure.
because not everybody knows what controversy has unfolded that has led to a point where Martin Iles, who is a very popular leader, has been let go in his contract. We don't know that. All we do know is that the Australian Christian lobby has not been reactionary. In fact, they've said in a statement that they've apologised for a delay in a response, but on the board, they don't want to act reflexively. What they are saying, this is Jim Wallace, who's the chairman of the ACL, says, we always will be committed to truth made public. That objectives of the ACL have not changed as the Australian Christian lobby. It is the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ that drives every aspect of the work that we do. So there is a little bit of an upset as to the ways that gifts are engaged here. But what we need is an organisation like the Australian Christian Lobby and a whole bunch of others that I mentioned before. We need these organisations and we need to be supportive of them, even if there's some things that happen that we might not be across all the details. Your thoughts here, David?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We do need these organisations, and we also need them to do their work well. And that's really hard. I mean, as I'm articulating here, there is this real balance to be found because it is right to say the ACL is not primarily an evangelistic organisation. At the same time, guys like me want to go, but if I'm not hearing the sweetness of the gospel in what's going on, then to what extent is it a Christian organization and not a morals organization, as good as those morals may be? And that's a really hard wire to balance on. And clearly there were differences of opinion on how that wire should be balanced. So I think it's really hard. But I don't want to be one of those guys that sticks the boot in at this point. I mean, I was a little bit disappointed with the way it worked out. But I also acknowledge I just don't know the detail. But we need organizations like this. We need them to do it well. And you know what? There's something about having the courage in public to be disliked that we need to support. And we also need to remind ourselves that we cannot, as Christians, be demanding that the people who speak in public are perfect at what they do. They're always going to make mistakes. They're always going to get it wrong. They're never going to articulate it beautifully the way that all of us want to have it done. So it's a hard position. It's not a job I'd want. That's what I'm saying. It's not a job that I would want at all.
And you can imagine that there would be undoubtedly robust conversation that's going on around the issues that are being confronted. And so when we have a situation where there might be something that was unresolved, and we all say, wouldn't we all like to know what the unresolved thing was? Sometimes you've just got to say, those things ought to remain confidential. If there was something unresolved, let it be unresolved. I don't need to know what the unresolved issue was, but I do need to know where I'm committed in what I'm doing. From wherever I'm listening right around Australia now, you're not there in Canberra with the Australian Christian Lobby, but somehow or other you've got to be able to say, this is where my commitment is. I need to hold firm, see this course through, because what is God doing in all of these things that have happened?
Yes.
There's a divine element that happens in these things. Any thoughts from you on that divine perspective?
So that last thing, yes, in the providence of God is something we always fall back on. He knows exactly what he's doing in this. He's already decided beforehand it would happen, and he'll work it through as he sees fit to his own glory in Jesus Christ. Of that, we have no doubt. Our job is to get on in the meantime. When these things happen in Christian organizations, there's a couple of things that always go on, I reckon. Often there's a disagreement of principle, and that clearly seems to be something that's going on here, a difference of approach that comes down to some principles of how they go about what they're doing. And that's okay. We can disagree all the time. And the employee always ought to be submitting to the employer. As Christians, that's what we ought to do. If I, for example, had a serious, significant disagreement of principle with my boss at the cathedral, then it's my job to resign, because he's in charge. He sets the agenda, right? So that's right. Sometimes there can be some personality things that go on as well. Who knows? We're all sinners that go on. The one thing I would say, Neil, is as Christian organizations, if there is a hint of actually impropriety or unfairness or, quite frankly, sin in the way that people have been treated, that we ought not to do the thing where we go, oh no, some things just remain quiet, and we have non-disclosure agreements. No. We as the people of God ought to be the people who have no fear at all about light being shone onto sin. Now, as I say that as a principle, because I don't see anything from what either side have said that sin is an issue here. It looks to me like there's been a difference of principle on how they ought to go about their job, and two different personalities have gone, given this difference of principle, we probably can't work together anymore. Beyond that, I don't know. Some of it will come out, some of it won't. At that point, sometimes it becomes gossip, and my need to know is unhelpful. And let's think what the future might look like. And in the providence of God, we'll trust him with it.
Perhaps there is a word of caution that listeners can hear in your thoughts there, David, too, and I'd echo those, is to not take sides. In actual fact, I, like so many listeners, love Martin Iles and want the best for his future, but I also love the work of the Australian Christian Lobby and recognise the value of what they do. And if people are saying, why am I not hearing lots of statements coming from either side? They've both made a statement. There will be, I think, what will perhaps be a right thing, maintaining a little radio silence, hoping that the commentariat, like you, David, and like me, won't actually take sides, but will actually give some level of grace to both sides that says, there's something here that might be unresolved, but that doesn't stop or hinder the work of what the Australian Christian Lobby is there to do.
Absolutely.
And it's easy, isn't it, to take sides and then one against the other, and I'm not going to give my support there anymore. But somehow or other, when you believe in something strongly, you do need to put your financial support and keep it going, even though it doesn't necessarily always agree with you.
Although what I think would be good at this point, and you don't have to take sides to do this, I think it would be good for us to use this as a catalyzing moment to have that conversation about what is that interplay between the gospel and the ethics that come from the gospel. How ought that to be communicated? That clearly lies at the heart of the disagreement that's going on here, I think, as I perceive it. And that's not a bad conversation for us to have. And if we can have it with the grace that says, let's have it as an in-principle conversation, wider than just the ACL, that's a really helpful thing to come, I think, to come out of this. And I'm no doubt the ACL board will listen along and take part of that conversation, and then people can work out what they think is the best way then to proceed with this work that we've all got to do of engaging with this world that we're in and those that govern it.
And it might be one of those things where you've got a statement from the ACL, from Jim Wallace, the chairman, and says it is the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ that drives every aspect of the work that we do. And with great strategists like Jim Wallace and other members of the ACL board, in some sense, we've got to give them some leeway and some grace to know that as they've deliberated on these things before God, and even if there is something that's unresolved, and even if it results in a crisis, that you must know that they've made decisions that they will live with if they're bad decisions, but that might be just keeping the track of what they're designed to do. And sometimes we are concerned about things like mission drifting away from the mission that we're all called to. And so we're back into a flow, into a stream of what's important. And you can waste a lot of time doing some things that are not in your stream, and somehow or other. But I do like what you're saying, though, David. This interplay between where it is, the gospel, the sweetness of understanding who Jesus is in the whole mix, and that actually fueling what we do. Yeah. And well, time will tell how that works out for the ACL, and let's give them maybe a bit of space, even as we have that wider conversation. And more, we are either on the front line of the battle for truth and righteousness. We're talking about engagement here. And there are those who have got their neck on the block, and it's pretty challenging when you're the leader of an organisation like, say, the Christian Lobby or Family Voice Australia or all of the other ones that we might be able to mention. Pretty tough being that, but either you're on the front line of the battle or you're a supporter of those who are on the front line of the battle. Everyone put our hand up right now if we're somewhere in the mix. If we're not on the front line, we're supporting the front line. It might be a prayer, but it might also be a financial support. I wouldn't be surprised if people get a fixation on what's happened with the ACL, that those who are prayerfully considering this might actually increase their support because they recognise there's a necessity for that. I don't know whether you've got any thought on that.
I agree. My only thought in response to that as well is to say church first, because remember, the proclamation of the gospel always first as a priority. And then if you genuinely think that organizations like the ACL have a purpose under God to promote what is for the benefit of society, to use that language from the prayer book earlier, then yes, by all means, put your money there. That's a better way to spend your money than a brand new flat screen TV. That's for sure.
You're going to be delivering one of the addresses at the Church and State Summit. That's happening this Friday and this Saturday. I think your session is on the Saturday afternoon. You're right. Going to be delivering a biblical survey, how the people of God engage with pagan governments. You're going to have an audience with listening ears, and a lot of those people are going to be on the front line. And a lot of those people in the audience are going to be the supporters as well. I'm not asking you for all the details. We've run out of time, but
we don't have the time, right? Yeah.
But you've got a few grenades to throw there, haven't you? Around this.
Well, not deliberately, but I think what's really challenged me as I've read through the biblical texts again is this overwhelming attitude of submission to the authority that seems to be pushing through, even when at times the stand is made. And so really the question is, where does the stand come? And who makes it and how? And I think that's really the question that we've had to grapple with. And so COVID has raised that issue for us. So the big question for us, of course, was the government picking on the church, or was it simply doing a rule for all? And does it actually make a difference to what we're thinking about? And then also the thing I want to just talk about briefly at the end is we've always got to be wary of who and what we're listening to in order that's shaping our voices. One of the things I fear, and I say this as a political conservative myself, Neil, a very strong political conservative myself. But one of the things I fear is that there are times when we mistake political conservatism for gospel ethics, and there's a danger that we slip too far in one direction. And so our response isn't actually, I think, as biblically shaped as it could be. And I wonder if over the last few years there's been a little bit too much anger in the way things have been done, a little bit too much stridency of opposition, where actually the scriptures probably called us to a slightly different approach. That some people may not like. My job ultimately as a preacher, because that's my job ultimately, is to say, here's what the Bible says, here's what I think it means for us as Christians, but you read it for yourself, you read it carefully, you make up your own mind. But if the last 3 or 4 years have not taught us anything, it's that we've got to think hard about how we're doing these things and know why we're responding the way that we're responding. And please, let's make sure it's biblical.
Well, I know that every delegate, everyone who is registered for that conference is in for good stuff when you take the stage and delivering that biblical survey. How the people of God engage with pagan governments. David Ould, Senior Associate Minister, St John's Anglican Cathedral in Parramatta in Sydney. I think you're going to have an influx of visitors this coming Sunday too.
Yeah.
And to connect...
Flying down from Brisbane when we come.
That's right. To connect with David Ould. Now, how do you spell that? O-U-L-D.
O-U-L-D, and that's my father's fault. He gave me that name. My father, bless him, he passed away at the start of this month. But one of the legacy things he's given me is a shocking lack of hair on the top of my head and an extra vowel in my surname. So it's David Ould, OULD.net. And that's where you can see some of the nonsense I get up to.
So a little old before your time, but you're a young,
yes,
you're
like
a young
no
man
one's
at
ever
heart.
made that joke before to me.
I know. You've heard it 1,000 times. David Ould, OULD.net, and you'll get into some really wonderful, wise blogs that David writes. You can also see him speak Church and State Summit, churchandstate.com.au. It's on this Friday and this Saturday. Church and State.
Not too late to get a ticket, Neil.
It's not too late. No, they've got a larger venue and there are some seats available. churchandstate.com.au. It'll be on in Brisbane for those listening in southeast Queensland or northern New South Wales, or if you want to get a late plane ticket and arrive in Brisbane. David, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts and heart with us today on 2020.
Oh, it's been a delight. Thank you so much, Neil. Let's do it again.